I'm Drew Stevenson, and this is part of my introduction to the administrative state for my courses. Here we're going to talk about federal versus state regulation. Now, we have both, just so my students know, and this is important to understand before you even start reading the cases about administrative law and regulatory agencies. We have federal agencies and state agencies, and sometimes the relationship between them is complicated. So there are some areas of regulation that are only regulated on the federal level and some only on the state level. There are others where there are counterpart agencies. So for example, we have the Environmental Protection Agency on the federal level, and then most states have some sort of local state environmental agency or pollution control agency. And the statutes, like the Clean Air Act, actually may require coordination and cooperation between the state and federal agencies. Similarly, the Social Security Administration is a federal program, but every state has a disability determination services that makes the initial determinations about eligibility for the Social Security disability program in a state agency. So the question is, why have federal versus state administrative agencies? And in the New Deal era, there was certainly a big push to have the federal government do more to help Americans and to pull America out of a depression and to help promote modernization of the workforce and public safety and so forth. And one of the arguments that's made for this is uniformity across state lines. And so you don't want to have a situation where a company is making products and they have to make kind of a little bit of a different product or put it in a different package in every state that they sell it, where they sell it, right? The companies and businesses definitely want to be able to do business and engage in commerce across state lines. And so uniformity of regulation is very helpful for business and the economy. And similarly, for individuals, if you travel across state lines, you don't want to be ambushed by the fact that certain activities or products that you own and so forth are illegal in the neighboring state. We do have some areas where this is true, right? And when we have interstate differences, we have smuggling. So we have interstate smuggling of tobacco and alcohol because the taxes on cigarettes and alcoholic beverages differ state to state. You could also, if we don't have national regulation, you could have a state where, let's say, machine guns, military grade machine guns are legal, and in a neighboring state, they're not. Well, the state that doesn't want to have machine guns in their state, or have the population armed with machine guns, is going to have trouble keeping people from just driving across state lines to a state where they're legal and buying them and coming back with those guns in the trunk of their car. And which, in fact, is what happens with certain types of firearms that are not allowed in certain states. We have interstate smuggling of those firearms. And so the other idea here is that when you have uniformity, you also have to develop the regulations by a broad consensus. And so instead of having regional factions of an industry, so let's say the apple producers in the Pacific Northwest kind of having a trade war with the apple producers of the Northeast. And instead of this type of regionalism, a federal government or federal agency will have to get all the players involved and make a regulation based on the whole country. And so we can engage in a broader consensus and maybe a more unifying approach to the regulation. There's a phrase that you should know in administrative law called the race to the bottom. And this is one of the big arguments for having federal regulation of different different industries. The idea is that states compete with each other, right? And states compete with each other to attract businesses to their state because businesses create jobs, increase tax revenue, help with economic development and infrastructure development, and so forth. So every state wants to have big manufacturing plants and other big employers in their state. And the and so well the incentive then is that states have a perverse incentive to have as few regulations as possible so they can attract as many businesses as possible. And this means we'll have, let's say, no pollution controls at all. To give a very kind of overdone example, if there were no federal regulations against dumping toxic chemicals in the environment, then you might think, well, states don't want their ground polluted and their drinking water polluted, so they would ban dumping toxic chemicals too, except that the politicians in charge of that state might be so desperate to attract big businesses and companies, major employers to their state, that they would have an incentive to just have no regulations and say, look, we've got to think about the economy. And so this is a race to the bottom, right? The race to the bottom is states will compete and end up with the sort of worst of all possible worlds with no regulation at all, even the regulations that people would want. The other idea with having the federal government regulate something is that they can get economies of scale. So if you think about an area or an industry, some aspect of public safety that we want to regulate, we can have 50 separate agencies in all 50 states. Every state could have an agency that's basically doing the same thing, or we could consolidate this into one national agency that that does this. And so an example would be pharmaceuticals, right? And approving pharmaceuticals for sale in the United States. You want to, if you go buy drugs at the pharmacy, a medicine, you want it to actually be what it says it is on the label and not have it kill you when you follow the instructions and so forth. And so if every state has to have its own sort of pharmaceutical regulation and Food and Drug Administration, well, that's redundant, right? Every one of those, we need staff and administrators and facilities, buildings for them to work in and so forth. And we could consolidate that when we have economies of scale if we regulate this nationally. There's also an argument you don't hear brought up very much today that having a federal regulation helps suppress government corruption. And here's the idea. It's if you have a local regulator or a state regulator, it's easier to bribe that person than to, let's say, favor your company or give your company a break than someone in Washington, D.C., who's the administrator for the whole country. If nothing else, the national bureaucrat is going to expect a much bigger bribe than your local bureaucrat. And to give an analogy to ancient Greece, the ancient Greeks had juries with 500 people on the jury, on the theory that it would make it too hard to bribe the jury. If you had so many people, nobody could afford to bribe that many jurors. And the idea with having a federal government is that there's too many parties, right? So if you think about all the different regions of the country and rival businesses in one industry, well, the national regulator, it's going to be hard to bribe them because all the rivals are going to offset each other. But a local one, it's a little bit easier to maybe succeed in your corruption. That's the theory anyways. Okay, now there's some trade-offs, obviously, and with having some things we lose when we have federal regulation. So there's always an argument for localized control. And the idea here is that the federal government, by necessity, is going to have to turn out one size fits all regulations. And so the same regulation is going to have to apply in New York City that applies in rural West Virginia. And if you have local regulation, it can be tailored to the local needs and conditions and might be therefore much more effective and efficient. And so there's always going to be an argument for localized control being better informed about the local needs and better tailored, and also to some extent more democratic, right? Because it gives people a more proportionate voice in their government when it's a local government than when it's national government, and your political voice is diffused among hundreds of millions of people. There's also a sort of trope that we have in that you'll see in some of these cases about the laboratories of democracy. Although I confess, I usually see this brought up in concurring and dissenting opinions. But people talk about the laboratories of democracy, and the idea, this is sort of the mirror image of the race to the bottom. And under this theory, the states, if they're allowed to innovate, can function as laboratories of regulation. And so each state is going to be trying to find the best regulations, and they might try new programs or adjusting their rules or creating certain administrative exceptions, or let's say tweaking their permitting and licensing programs a little bit and come up with something that actually works really well. Imagine one state was much better at eliminating homelessness or infant mortality or the spread of an epidemic than other comparable states. And maybe those other states could kind of learn from the state that tried something and it really worked. And so the idea is if we decentralize regulation, the states can innovate and can find much more advanced and enlightened forms of or approaches to regulating. There's also a concern about concentrated power when you nationalize things. And the argument here is, if you think of the old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and concentrated power corrupts concentratedly, I guess. In other words, when you concentrate all the power in the national government in Washington, D.C., the person who's in charge of that really has a lot of power. And so apart from just the fears that Americans have of tyranny and someone being on a power trip and things like that, you also have to think about the fact that we are fallible human beings. And if you give all the authority and discretion over a whole of oversight over an industry to one person, when that person makes a mistake, it affects everybody. If that person adopts a misguided policy, it affects everyone. It has system-wide effects. In other words, concentrated power brings systemic risk. And when you have regulation on the state level, you decentralize the decision-making. So if you have one state official who is incompetent or a goofball or just deeply misguided and adopts terrible policies, it doesn't affect everyone else. It sort of does, this is a damage control. It confines it to one area where that person was regulating. And so there are some arguments, especially when we're talking about high stakes things where the effects or implications of making a bad policy decision could be catastrophic, that maybe we do want to decentralize it so that we don't have one person's mistake affecting everyone in the country. Okay, that concludes our lecture about federal versus state regulation. Sorry, I previewed my slide for the next lecture, and some of the trade-offs. And this is helpful for my students to keep in mind as you're reading through the cases, because some of the cases do involve complex interplays between state and federal regulators. And an example, early in our discussion, we're going to do Whitman versus American Trucking Association. And that case involves some federal regulation and some state counterparts. And it can be sort of hard to sort out if you don't really have your bearings yet.